You're a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, around 2500 BCE. You've just finished harvesting your barley when a messenger arrives at your village with news that makes your blood run cold. War is coming, and in 3 days, you'll be marching to battle alongside your neighbors, most of whom have never held a weapon in their lives. You'll face an enemy you've never seen, fighting for reasons you barely understand, and there's a very good chance you won't be coming home. This was the reality for most of human history. War wasn't a profession, it was an interruption, a terrifying pause in normal life that could cost you everything. But something changed. Over the course of about 2,000 years, from roughly 3000 BCE to 1000 BCE, warfare was completely transformed. The amateur militias of farmers and craftsmen gradually gave way to something revolutionary: professional armies. Men who trained for war every single day, men who knew nothing but combat, men who were paid to fight, and for better or worse, were damn good at it. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at once, but when it did happen, it changed everything. It changed how battles were fought, how empires were built, and ultimately how power itself was understood and wielded. The story begins in Sumer, in what's now southern Iraq, where the world's first cities were rising from the marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These weren't just villages that got big, they were something entirely new in human history. Dense urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, surrounded by agricultural lands that fed them. Cities like Uruk, and Lagash became wealthy beyond anything seen before, accumulating grain surpluses, precious metals, and trade goods. And here's the problem with wealth: it attracts attention. The earliest Sumerian cities defended themselves the way most societies did back then. When war threatened, the Lugal, or big man, would call up the able-bodied men. They'd grab whatever weapons they had, usually spears or clubs, maybe a copper axe if they were lucky, and they'd march out to defend their city. These weren't soldiers, they were farmers playing soldier, and against other farmers playing soldier, that was fine, but it wasn't sustainable, and it definitely wasn't effective. Taking men away from their fields during planting or harvest season could mean famine. Training was minimal because nobody had time for it. Discipline was poor because these men weren't warriors, they were your neighbors and cousins who'd rather be literally anywhere else. The Sumerians were the first to realize they needed a better system. Around 2700 BCE, we start seeing evidence in cuneiform tablets and artwork of something different: standing forces. Not huge armies, mind you. We're talking about maybe a few hundred men per city-state at first. But these men weren't farmers who fought sometimes. They were fighters who fought all the time. They were equipped by the state with proper weapons and armor: bronze spearheads, copper helmets, leather cloaks reinforced with bronze discs. They trained together, developing tactics and formations. And most importantly, they were paid. They received regular rations of barley and beer, textiles for clothing, and occasionally plots of land. This might not sound revolutionary to us, but think about what it meant. For the first time in history, violence was becoming professionalized. Being good at killing people was now a job, a career path, a way to make a living. And the implications were staggering. A professional soldier is a completely different creature from a conscripted farmer. He's been training since he was young. He knows his equipment intimately. He understands formations and tactics. He's physically conditioned for combat. And perhaps most importantly, he's psychologically prepared for violence in a way that normal people just aren't. The advantages were immediately apparent. When Lagash went to war with Umma around 2450 BCE, a conflict we know about from the famous Steel of Vultures, the armies that clashed weren't peasant levies. They were organized phalanxes of spearmen, fighting in tight formation with large rectangular shields, moving in coordinated ranks. This was sophisticated warfare, and it required sophisticated soldiers. The city-states that maintained professional corps to their armies consistently defeated those that relied solely on militia levies. And so, the arms race began. If your neighbor had professional soldiers, you needed them too, or you'd be conquered and your city burned to the ground. But maintaining a professional army created new problems that would shape world history for millennia. Here's the thing. Professional soldiers are expensive, really expensive. That farmer militia, they cost almost nothing. They brought their own equipment, they fed themselves, and when the war was over, they went back to their fields. Professional soldiers needed to be paid year-round. They needed equipment provided for them. They needed trainers and officers. They needed barracks and supply chains. All of this required a level of taxation and administrative sophistication that many early states simply didn't have. This is where we see the rise of what historians call the fiscal military state. To maintain a professional army, you needed a professional bureaucracy to collect taxes, organize logistics, and manage resources. You needed scribes to keep records, officials to oversee granaries, and an entire administrative apparatus. In Sumerian cities, we can literally watch this happen in the archaeological record. The number of administrative tablets explodes. The size of palace complexes grows. The state becomes more involved in every aspect of life because it has to be. It needs to extract enough resources to feed and equip its army. War, in other words, didn't just change how fighting was done, it transformed the very nature of government itself.
Now, while Sumer was pioneering professional warfare, something even more dramatic was happening in Egypt. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE created something unprecedented, a territorial state spanning hundreds of miles. And King Narmer, the legendary unifier, didn't conquer the Nile Valley with part-time farmers. He did it with what might be the world's first truly professional army. The early Egyptian military was relatively small by later standards, probably numbering in the low thousands, but it was highly organized, well-equipped, and permanent. These weren't men who fought occasionally, they were career soldiers, and Egypt's early dominance in the region was built on their backs. What's fascinating about the Egyptian military is how quickly it became institutionalized. By the Old Kingdom period, around 2600 BCE, we have extensive records of military organization. Soldiers were organized into units with clear hierarchies, there were standard-issue weapons and equipment, there were military training grounds, and here's the kicker, there were pensions. Veteran soldiers were granted land to farm in their old age, ensuring their loyalty and giving young men an incentive to enlist. Egypt had basically invented the military-industrial complex 3,000 years before America did. But even Egypt's professional army paled in comparison to what was developing in Mesopotamia during the Akkadian Empire. When Sargon of Akkad came to power around 2334 BCE, he inherited the Sumerian tradition of professional warfare and took it to an entirely new level. Sargon didn't just have a professional army, he had a professional army of 5,400 men, a number we know from cuneiform records, and he personally led them on campaign after campaign, conquering virtually all of Mesopotamia and parts of what's now Syria, Iran, and Turkey. This wasn't a city-state defending itself, this was conquest on an industrial scale. Sargon's army was revolutionary in several ways. First, it was ethnically diverse, drawing men from all over his empire, which actually increased its effectiveness by bringing together different fighting traditions and skills. Second, it was mobile in a way that earlier armies weren't. Sargon could move his forces quickly over long distances, striking targets before they could effectively mobilize defenses. Third, and most importantly, it was loyal to him personally, not to a city or a temple or a council. Sargon paid his soldiers directly from the spoils of conquest, making them dependent on his success and invested in his continued rule. He'd basically invented the professional standing army as we understand it, and for the next 50 years, his army was virtually unbeatable. But here's where things get interesting and a little dark. Professional armies created a new problem that societies are still grappling with today. What happens when the guys with all the weapons decide they want to be in charge? In Sumer, soldiers were just one part of society. They served the temple or the palace, but they didn't control it. With Sargon, that changed. His power came from his army, and his army's power came from him. It was a feedback loop that concentrated authority in a way that was fundamentally new. The Akkadian Empire wasn't built on religious authority or a democratic consensus or ancient tradition. It was built on the simple fact that Sargon had the best army and wasn't afraid to use it. This pattern would repeat throughout ancient history. Professional armies made empire possible, but they also made everything unstable. Because if your power comes from your army, then you're only as secure as your army's loyalty. And armies, it turns out, can be remarkably fickle. The Akkadian Empire eventually collapsed, not because it was defeated by an external enemy, but because it fragmented from within. Regional commanders with their own military forces broke away. The professional army that built the empire also tore it apart. After the Akkadian collapse, Mesopotamia entered a period of chaos, but it didn't last long. The third dynasty of rose around 2100 BCE, and they learned from Akkad's mistakes. The III kings maintained a professional military, but they also developed an incredibly sophisticated bureaucracy to control it. We're talking about an administrative state that would make a modern government jealous. Everything was recorded, everything was tracked. Soldiers were received standardized rations that were carefully documented, equipment was issued and accounted for, commanders were rotated to prevent them from building independent power bases. The III kings understood that a professional army was necessary for power, but it was also dangerous, so they built systems to contain that danger. But the real quantum leap in military professionalism came from an unexpected place: the chariot. Around 2000 BCE, someone, probably in the southern Urals or the Caucasus, figured out how to domesticate horses and hitch them to light two-wheeled chariots. This doesn't sound like a big deal until you see one in action. A chariot could move across a battlefield faster than anything else. It was mobile, it was imposing, and in the hands of a skilled crew, it was absolutely devastating. Charioteers could charge enemy formations, wheel around, and charge again before the poor infantry could react. They could shower enemies with arrows from a moving platform. They were, in short, the tanks of the ancient world. Here's the thing about chariots: they're incredibly difficult to use effectively. You need horses, which are expensive to breed and maintain. You need specialized chariots, which require skilled craftsmen to build. You need drivers who can control a team of horses at high speed over rough terrain while someone else is shooting arrows. This requires years of training. You can't just hand someone a chariot and expect them to be effective. They need to practice constantly from childhood. Chariotry, more than any other military technology, demanded full-time professionals, and societies that could field effective chariot forces dominated their neighbors.
The Middle Kingdom Egyptians adopted chariots around 1650 BCE, probably learning the technology from the Hyksos invaders who briefly controlled parts of Egypt. When the New Kingdom pharaohs expelled the Hyksos and reunited Egypt around 1550 BCE, they didn't just adopt chariot technology, they became obsessed with it. Egyptian pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II personally trained as charioteers. They built huge stables and training grounds. They developed an elite chariot corps that became the core of their military power. These weren't part-time warriors, they were full-time professional soldiers who trained every day of their lives. And with them, Egypt built an empire that stretched from Nubia to Syria. But the true masters of professional chariot warfare were the Hittites. The Hittite kingdom in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, built their entire military system around heavy chariots crewed by 3 men instead of the usual 2. These things were absolute monsters. They'd plow into enemy formations like battering rams, breaking through lines and creating chaos. The Hittites maintained a professional chariot force of thousands of vehicles, each crew trained from youth, supported by a massive infrastructure of stables, workshops, and training facilities. When the Hittites fought Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, probably the best documented battle of the Bronze Age, it was a clash of professional armies on a scale that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Both sides fielded tens of thousands of soldiers with thousands of chariots, and both sides fought to a bloody stalemate, eventually signing what might be the world's first peace treaty between great powers. What's crucial to understand is that by this point, around 1300 BCE, professional warfare had become the norm across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Egypt, the Hittites, the Mitanni in Syria, the Kassites in Babylon, the Assyrians in northern Iraq, all of them maintained standing professional armies. War was no longer something that happened occasionally, it was constant. Armies campaigned every year, conquering territory, extracting tribute, and defending borders. And this constant warfare created a sophisticated military culture that permeated everything. The Assyrians took this to its logical extreme, starting around 1400 BCE and really hitting their stride by 900 BCE. The Assyrians built what was arguably the first true military state. Everything about Assyrian society was organized around warfare. They pioneered new technologies, ironed weapons, siege engines, cavalry that could fight independently instead of just scouting. They developed brutal psychological warfare tactics, deliberately cultivating a reputation for extreme violence to terrify enemies into submission. But most importantly, they perfected the art of maintaining a large, professional, multi-ethnic standing army. At its height, the Assyrian army probably numbered over 100,000 men, all of them professional soldiers, supported by the most sophisticated logistics system the ancient world had ever seen. Assyrian soldiers weren't conscripts, they were career warriors, often from families that had served in the military for generations. They trained constantly, they were equipped with standardized gear, they followed strict discipline and chain of command, they received regular pay and, for those who served long enough, land grants. In other words, the Assyrian military looked a lot more like a modern army than anything that came before it. And for 300 years, it was virtually unstoppable. The Assyrians conquered everything from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, creating an empire that dwarfed anything previous. And they did it with professional soldiers who knew that war wasn't just part of life, it was their entire life. But here's the problem with building your entire society around a professional military. You become dependent on it. The Assyrian state required constant expansion to pay its army with plunder and to reward veterans with land. When expansion stopped, when there were no more easy conquests, the system started to break down. Soldiers became restless, commanders built independent power bases, and when the empire finally faced serious external threats in the late 7th century BCE from the Medes and Babylonians and others, it collapsed with shocking speed. Within a generation, the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen was gone, its cities burned, its people scattered. The lesson here is profound, and it echoes through history. Professional armies make empire possible, but they also make it vulnerable. You need professional soldiers to conquer and hold vast territories, but those same professional soldiers can destroy you if they're not kept satisfied, kept loyal, and kept busy. It's a cycle that would repeat with the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and every empire that came after. By the time we reached the first millennium BCE, professional warfare was the standard across the civilized world. The age of the farmer militia was over in any society that wanted to compete. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, built an empire stretching from India to Egypt using a professional army of unprecedented size and sophistication. The Greek city-states developed hoplite warfare, where citizen soldiers trained together for years to fight in perfect phalanx formation. Even the Romans, who started with a citizen militia, gradually transitioned to a professional army as they realized that conquest and empire required full-time warriors. The rise of professional armies changed everything about ancient warfare and ancient society. Battles became more deadly because soldiers were better trained. Wars became more frequent because states had the capacity to wage them year-round. Empires became larger because professional armies could project power over vast distances. But societies also became more militarized, more centralized, more focused on the extraction of resources to feed the military machine. The fiscal military state that emerged in ancient Sumer reached its full expression in empires like Assyria, Persia, and eventually Rome. There's something both impressive and disturbing about this transformation. On one hand, professional warfare represented a kind of progress. Soldiers who trained their entire lives were undeniably more effective than amateur warriors. The great empires of the ancient world achieved things that wouldn't have been impossible with amateur militias. Massive engineering projects, sophisticated administration, cultural achievements that still inspire us today. On the other hand, the professionalization of war made it more brutal, more efficient at destruction, and more central to how societies organized themselves. War stopped being an occasional interruption and became a permanent feature of civilization. And here's the thing that should make us uncomfortable. We never really moved past this. The professional armies that emerged in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Near East established a pattern that continues today. Modern militaries are their direct descendants. We still maintain standing professional forces. We still build our foreign policy around what those forces can accomplish. We still struggle with the balance between military power and civilian control. The rise of professional armies in ancient times wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was the moment when organized violence became a permanent, professionalized part of human civilization, and we're still living with the consequences.